Hey guys, it's Mike here, and in this video, I'm going to be reviewing Hobbs and SHAW, which is the newest spin-off movie from the Fast and Furious franchise. Now, I've been a fan of the Fast and Furious movies since I was a kid. It started as kind of a Point Break remake about a cop trying to bust a gang of drivers who were robbing people to get by. The series has certainly had its ups and downs, but from Fast 5 onward, it truly found its footing as an over-the-top ensemble action series. This also coincided with it becoming more popular than ever. However, despite becoming less realistic, its foundations in driving and its core characters remain largely intact. And the filmmakers always tried to find ways to incorporate the cars and that lifestyle in the action. And despite losing its original main character of Paul Walker, it was still able to continue on and retain its popularity. However, with that being said, I feel like the most recent Fast and Furious movie, Fate of the Furious, went a little too far with the ridiculousness. Sure, there's always been some unrealistic moments, but with 8, it felt like it started to become detrimental to the story and the tone of the film. We had Vin Diesel turning evil, super spies, and the main characters being chased by a submarine on the ice that was shooting torpedoes, which resulted in a scene where The Rock literally throws a torpedo. You even had Jason Statham return as a good guy and befriend the team, even after he killed one of the main characters. And yet they kind of just sweep that under the rug. So much for justice for Han, right? As a result, it ended up being one of the weakest films in the series. So going into Hobbs and SHAW, this movie seemed to be taking what Fast 8 did to the extreme, throwing any semblance of realism out the window, as well as much of what made the Fast franchise so endearing. It looked like just another ridiculous Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson movie like he's been making in recent years, such as Skyscraper and San Andreas. So going into this movie, my expectations weren't particularly high, and upon seeing the movie, I would have to say that it was pretty much what I expected. Now, the story of Hobbs and SHAW revolves around a brand new super virus that an evil organization is trying to use to bring about global change. Their primary agent and the main antagonist of the film is played by Idris Elba, who was a former super spy that's been artificially augmented with superhuman abilities, and he'll stop at nothing to get this virus. However, Shaw's sister Hattie, played by Vanessa Kirby, is able to steal the virus and goes on the run. The two former enemies, Hobbs and SHAW, must team up together to try and save Shaw's sister and the world in the process. And naturally, a lot of action ensues. So as you might imagine from the synopsis of this movie, it's just over-the-top ridiculous throughout. And while this is intentional, it isn't always to the benefit of the film, which I'll be discussing shortly. But let me first get into the things that I liked about this movie. Now, first up, we have the dynamic between The Rock and Jason Statham as Hobbs and SHAW respectively. And this is easily the best part of the film. Carrying over their characters from the past two Fast movies, it's clear that these guys just don't like each other or get along. So having to place the two of them together in this situation, in this sort of buddy cop role, ends up working out pretty well, because they're constantly cracking jokes at others' expenses and trying to outdo each other, which we see during action scenes and other moments throughout the film, such as the one that we saw in the trailer, in which both of them have their own respective hallway that they have to fight a number of henchmen going down. And speaking of action scenes, there are some fun action scenes littered throughout, with The Rock easily beating up the bad guys and Jason Statham showing off a lot of his martial arts abilities, such as during one fun action sequence in an apartment. And one of the big things that ties into both of those previous elements has to be the humor of the film, as the film is definitely not taking itself seriously. As not only are The Rock and Jason Statham cracking jokes, but so are plenty of the other characters, and many of the action scenes and scenarios they find themselves in are intentionally funny and over the top, which for many people might be enough to give them a solid film. However, getting into my cons, I would have to say that they take the over-the-top elements way too far, where there are so many things that happen in this movie that not only don't make sense, but are so unbelievable and ridiculous that it's hard to suspend your disbelief and really get invested in the action. Like, we have these huge set pieces one after the next, with our characters barely taking any damage whatsoever, even when they jump off the top buildings, get into car crashes, and even helicopter crashes. None of it seems to really do much to anyone involved. And then you have Idris Elba's character, who is involved in so many things that would easily kill a normal human being, but he's been augmented so that it doesn't. But nonetheless, he should at least take a little bit of damage, and yet, even when massive parts of buildings fall directly on top of him, he walks out without even a scratch. So not only do most of our main characters have ridiculous plot armor, but so does the villain. And then add to the fact that there's so much CGI happening during most of these action scenes that everything just starts to feel like a video game as a result. And it takes away pretty much all of the tension, and at least for me, made it pretty much impossible for me to get excited or really into a lot of the scenes that were happening. And the film definitely does utilize some practical effects and stunts, but because there's so much CG going on, combined with the fact that everything is shot on digital, makes it hard to decipher what's real and what isn't at times, which oftentimes results in you just assuming that everything isn't real. Now, I know the Fast and Furious movies have had a lot of unrealistic scenes, especially from 5 onward, such as when Dom caught Letty on top of a car when she was flung through the air at many miles per hour, and them flooring a car from skyscraper to skyscraper in Fast 7. But this is basically an entire movie made up of the dumbest scenes from each of the Fast and Furious movies. You have The Rock constantly doing superhuman things, a literal superhuman in Idris Elba, and the list goes on. Honestly, this feels like a movie that they would watch in the world of Idiocracy, likely while drinking Mountain Dew and eating Doritos, although they do pair quite nicely. And another problem I had with the film is the editing. A lot of it feels really choppy, and oftentimes characters just kind of show up in places without the proper establishing shot to lead into it. And it gives me the impression that there was a number of reshoots involving this film, especially in the final act, where it switches from night to day in 10 minutes in-universe. And it's really hard to overlook that when you pay close enough attention. Now, some scenes do have some decent lighting and are shot pretty well in the first act. However, many of the fight scenes suffer from quick cutting and a little bit too much close-up shaky cam. So I wouldn't exactly go into this expecting John Wick or The Raid. And considering that it was directed by David Leitch, who was involved in Atomic Blonde and the John Wick movies, the action in this movie should have been so much better. And speaking of the final act, it feels really tacked on. There's a section of the movie before it where it seems like it could have realistically ended, but then we have a whole other act afterward. It kind of reminds me a little bit of what happened with The Last Jedi, where everything felt like it would have ended in Snoke's throne room, but then it just kept going and going. And to be honest, this entire section feels like it was just The Rock flexing his ego. Most of the scenes in the movie involving him also give off this impression, considering the fact that he's never been augmented and is supposed to just be a normal, badass cop, yet he's still performing superhuman feats at a constant rate. Now, there were a lot of arguments between The Rock and Vin Diesel on the set of the Fast and Furious movies that he was involved in, and then it became sort of a competition of egos, which probably contributed to Fate of the Furious being one of the weaker films, and that definitely carries over into this movie, with The Rock flexing his muscles and creative control pretty hard in this movie, which I think is one of the biggest detriments of the film. However, this wouldn't have been anywhere near as big of a problem if the film was actually well written, but there's so much lazy writing, retcons, and straight-up plot holes in this movie that I might have to go out on a limb and say it's actually the worst written of the Fast and Furious franchise. And that's saying a lot because some of the earlier ones weren't exactly the best written. Now, as far as my rating goes, I definitely enjoyed certain parts as well as the relationship between The Rock and Jason Statham, but the ridiculous CGI, over-the-top action, poor editing, and weak script make it hard to say that this is a good movie. So I think I'm going to give Hobbs and Shaw a 6 out of 10. Although when comparing it to the other movies in the Fast franchise, the number would probably be lower, like a 4 or a 3. Now, is this the worst Fast and Furious movie? In some ways, I would say yes. Aside from sharing a couple characters, this didn't really need to be a part of the Fast and Furious franchise. Without the other characters that the world was built around, it just feels like another dumb Rock or Jason Statham movie, with the franchise label slapped onto it. However, as a standalone movie, I do think I enjoyed this more than Too Fast, Too Furious, and maybe Fast and Furious. Not to be confused with The Fast and the Furious, although I don't blame anyone for being confused at the naming conventions of this franchise. But either way, I wouldn't really blame anyone for saying this is the worst one yet. So what did you guys think of Hobbs and Shaw? Have you seen it yet, and where would you rank it among the other Fast and Furious movies? Let me know down below. If you like this video, then make sure to like it and share it with your friends. It really helps the channel. And if you're new to this channel, then make sure to subscribe and enable notifications so that you can see all of my videos and community posts right away when they come out. And make sure to stick around, because there's a lot more to come in the future.
Yeah, and you better subscribe.